This is the untold story of the Polish Underground Army, the largest resistance movement of World War II. How they took the fight to the occupying German forces and changed the course of the war. The Underground Army. After the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Nazis were now also invading Europe, and the German war machine was becoming more powerful. The Underground Army was actually becoming bigger and stronger. The Poles never officially surrendered to the Germans. They began to plan secret operations using their network of communications to take the fight to the Germans. They moved to their next stage of disruptive actions. First, there was intelligence gathering, stealing German secrets and passing them on to the Allies. They freed prisoners captured by the occupying forces, and finally, the use of propaganda. After entering Poland, the Germans introduced terror. They wanted to intimidate Poles and suppress the resistance movement.
On the Warsaw Street, each day was some execution. 1,000 people each month was shot on the street, created terror.
But Poles did not allow themselves to be intimidated.
Najlepszym przykładem będzie historia Elżbiety Zachorskiej. Ta młoda dziewczyna, idąc warszawską ulicą, zauważyła niemiecki plakat propagandowy, który zerwała. Zauważyli to Niemcy, aresztowali ją i skazali na śmierć przez rozstrzelanie.
Judicial verdict: student Elżbieta Zachorska was sentenced to death for sabotage, defacing posters. Before death, her last wish was to say goodbye to her father. Then he handed over cookies and warm gloves. Before the execution, she was calm. She did not allow herself to be blindfolded. Her last words were, "Poland has not perished yet."
Terror rodził opór i odwet. Odwet rodził terror.
Meanwhile, unknown to the Poles, the Germans had even bigger plans. The occupation of Poland was part of it. Germany developed detailed plans of the extermination of the Slavic peoples. It was called General Plan Ost, or Master Plan for the East.
Naziści jeszcze przed atakiem na Polskę przygotowali tak zwane czarne księgi, czyli listy osób, które należało wyeliminować. Operacja najszerszy zasięg miała na ziemiach polskich anektowanych do III Rzeszy. Do końca 1939 roku Niemcy zamordowali tam około 60 000 działaczy politycznych, duchownych i przedstawicieli inteligencji.
The Germans intended to control the Poles by removing influential people.
If you cut your head, mean the hand not work. And the intelligentsia, educated people, are like the head.
Cel strategiczny, jakim jest eliminacja elit politycznych, kulturalnych, religijnych czy wojskowych, bardzo precyzyjnie i krótko ujął Adolf Hitler, mówiąc, że tylko naród, którego warstwy kierownicze zostaną zniszczone, da się zepchnąć do roli niewolników. Chodziło o to, aby w łatwiejszy sposób przejąć kontrolę nad podbitym terytorium oraz aby uniemożliwić lub osłabić działalność konspiracyjną, której Niemcy się spodziewali.
That's right now. Poland lost so much educated people and created Hitler the same, Stalin did the same.
When the Soviet Union took its share of Poland, as dictated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin, like the Germans, wanted effectively to decapitate the head of Polish society. One of those groups that was particularly targeted by Stalin were the officers.
Do eksterminacji polskich elit sprowadzono specjalnych funkcjonariuszy.
The NKVD was political police, a secret police, a force which was really responsible for terror, mass murder, arrests.
Każdy był wyszkolony do zabijania w wygłuszonych piwnicach dziesiątek ludzi dziennie przez wiele dni. Otrzymywał wtedy premię pieniężną za zabicie każdego człowieka, która wynosiła równowartość 2 kg chleba.
Wiosną 1940 roku na ziemiach anektowanych przez Sowietów funkcjonariusze NKWD zamordowali 22 000 obywateli polskich. Głównie oficerów, przywódców politycznych, działaczy społecznych i duchownych.
Officers were taken and shot into pits in the forest effectively.
Almost all of them were murdered in the same way, a close-range shot at the base of the skull during mass killings in the forest of Katyn.
And this is absolutely shocking and horrifying because in no rules of warfare is the execution of prisoners of war in uniform permitted.
Celem Sowietów było wyeliminowanie wszystkich potencjalnych przeciwników i przemienienie Polski w komunistyczną republikę.
Of course, Stalin denied that he'd had anything to do with these murders and immediately turned around and blamed the Germans. Katyn became a really sore point and made it extremely difficult for the Poles to in any way deal with the Soviets during the war. It was very inconvenient for the Western Allies, particularly when they were allied with Stalin, to be working with a person who'd given an order for this terrible crime.
Katyn cast a shadow on Polish-Russian relations and practically made it impossible for the underground army to cooperate with the Soviets. For the Nazis, uncovering a massacre served their propaganda interests. They organized group trips to Katyn for foreign journalists. The Germans wanted the whole world to learn about the Soviet crimes so as to make it difficult for the Allies to cooperate with the Russians. The Soviets also deported en masse Poles to prisons and labor camps in the most distant regions of Russia. Most of the hundreds of thousands of exiled Poles never returned. In May 1940, the British and their allies were driven out of France by German forces. The situation was critical. Germany was conquering all of Europe. After Germany's alliance with Japan and their attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US finally joined the war, but were yet to set foot on European soil, and the Germans seemed unbeatable. Inside Poland and across Europe, the Nazis were beginning to set up structures and systems for mass genocide. Poland became the arena of the greatest genocide in history. It was here that the Nazis implemented their murderous plan to exterminate the Jewish population, the Holocaust. Auschwitz, the Nazi concentration and extermination camp, has become the world's symbol of the atrocities.
In the further course of the German occupation, mainly members of the Polish resistance were interned here. Concrete plans for the murder of millions of Slavs and Jews were made starting in 1941 and, in the case of the Jews, put into practice as the Holocaust.
Even under such terrible atrocities, the underground army found a new way to strike back against the Nazi regime. They penetrated the darkest place on earth to reveal the Holocaust to the world. But to do it took bravery beyond belief.
Rotmistrz Witold Pilecki podjął się niewyobrażalnego.
An extraordinary man who volunteered effectively to get himself into Auschwitz. He was taken on the second transport to Auschwitz and immediately set about trying to, first of all, figure out what this camp was, what it was about, how it was set up, how it ran, and also to create a kind of resistance movement there.
Stworzył siatkę podziemną i stanął na jej czele.
It was tasked with improving inmate morale, provide news from outside, distribute extra food and clothing to its members, and to train detachments to take over the camp in the event of a relief attack. They were organized as secret cells, each of 5 members. Pilecki's networks stole parts from German camp workplaces and constructed a radio station that was secretly used during forced labor outside the camp walls. After 7 months, we had our own broadcasting station where Second Lieutenant 4 worked in a spot where SS personnel were reluctant to enter. we broadcast programs repeated by other stations, news about the number of admissions and deaths in the camp, as well as the state and conditions of the prisoners. The authorities were furious because we broadcasted it at different times, so it was difficult to detect us.
Wiosną 1943 roku Pilecki uciekł z obozu i sporządził obszerny, szczegółowy raport na temat skali nazistowskich zbrodni na Żydach i więźniach innych narodowości.
And constantly reported to the Polish underground about the genocide of the Jews. His reports thus reached the Polish government in exile in London. Thanks to Pilecki, the Western powers were already informed about the murder of European Jews in German-occupied Poland in 1942.
Despite Pilecki's telling the world there was no immediate action by the Allies against the atrocities committed by invaders, the Polish underground army knew they had to fight for truth and survival. The Germans used propaganda in the fight, but the underground state did not remain on the back foot. Now came a new phase in the underground battle. Poles needed a symbol that they could use as an act of disobedience and unity. In 1942, the Underground Army organized a contest to design an emblem to represent the resistance movement. And the winning design was by Anna Smolenska. The sign of the anchor has become a sign of the Polish resistance.
Co oznaczał dokładnie znak kotwicy? Łączył dwie litery. P jest to Polska, W walka. Kotwica zaś oznacza nadzieję na odzyskanie wolności. Stał się symbolem polskiego podziemia, państwa, które mimo terroru nie poddaje się i wciąż walczy. Znak Polski walczącej malowano potajemnie w miastach, na murach i pomnikach. Za namalowanie albo posiadanie kotwicy wielu zapłaciło torturami i śmiercią.
The emblem represented the underground state's struggle to regain independence. The attack on Poland, the murder of the elite, and terror by Germany, instead of crushing the will of the people, had an opposite effect on Poles. They increased resistance and organized the underground structures, newspapers, propaganda, and military action.
Wyjątkowo sprytnym i zaciętym człowiekiem podziemia był podporucznik harcmistrz Jan Bytnar-Rudy. Był jednym z dowódców młodego pokolenia i współtwórcą bezkrwawej, ale równie potężnej metody walki z Niemcami. Mówimy tutaj o małym sabotażu, czyli działaniach polegających m.in. na podziemnym kolportażu prasy, malowaniu antyniemieckich haseł na murach, usuwaniu symboli niemieckiego panowania.
Underground press, books, and radio programs were published. Posters and satirical drawings were printed. Illegal education and secret schooling was conducted for a range of grades, including higher education.
pewnej sprytnej akcji polskiego podziemia mówiło nawet BBC. Polacy podrobili kilka wydań niemieckiej, polskojęzycznej gazety propagandowej, zmieniając treść w sposób karykaturalny. Pismo wyglądało łudząco podobnie do oryginalnego, z tą różnicą, że znalazły się tam artykuły ośmieszające hitlerowców. Gazetę wprowadzono do obiegu, a gdy Polacy wpadli na to, że jest to drwina podziemnej propagandy, płacili gazeciarzom nawet kilkaset razy więcej niż za zwykłą prasę. Pieniądze zasiliły budżet podziemia, a Niemcy nawet nic nie zauważyli.
The underground army came up with clever ways to make these publications and to prevent them from being discovered by the Germans. Duplicators were used for mass copying of propaganda materials. Here is the simplest frame construction. A small suitcase version that is easy to hide and transport. A specially prepared matrix was placed on clean paper, and the paint was squeezed through it with a rubber roller. Finally, the copy of the document saved on the master was transferred onto the paper. The underground army now had their own press and propaganda machine. As the underground communication network becomes more sophisticated, they use not only propaganda and newspapers, but also secret radio communication. Polish radio stations were among the most modern.
Inżynier Tadeusz Heftman, pionier polskiego krótkofalarstwa. Był głównym projektantem polskich wojskowych warsztatów radiowych w Stanmore pod Londynem. Produkowane tam stacje nadawczo-odbiorcze miały zwartą, solidną konstrukcję o niewielkich rozmiarach i wadze 6 kg. Były trudne do wykrycia. Na płycie czołowej umieszczano klucz telegraficzny. Za najlepszy uchodzi model AP5 o zasięgu do 1500 km.
The radio broadcast could even be picked up in London. Information they sent included troop movements, military infrastructure, and the occupation situation. In addition, they collected information in other countries. Polish intelligence in these countries was the most valuable source of information for the Allies.
The Poles gathered intelligence about German troop movements, for example, throughout the war. And of course, later what the Soviets were up to as well, but particularly this was tremendously important in terms of how the West was going to deal with the Germans. Important even for things like planning the Normandy landings. The Poles had spies all over Germany and in the other occupied countries as well, because of course Poles had emigrated to many, many places.
Konstruowano również przemyślne skrytki do ukrywania tajnych materiałów. Te najprostsze mógł wykonać praktycznie każdy. Bardziej skomplikowane konstrukcje były produkowane przez wyspecjalizowane komórki polskiego podziemia, które osiągały szczyty pomysłowości. Najpopularniejsze były ruchome skrytki, znajdujące się w przedmiotach codziennego użytku, takich jak walizki, wieczne pióra, termosy, teczki czy laski. Do przechowywania niewielkich przedmiotów doskonale nadawały się skrytki meblowe, wykonane w szafach, biurkach, stołach czy kredensach. Służyły głównie do przenoszenia tajnych materiałów.
Secret underground documents, microfilms, and underground publications were hidden in small hiding places. In larger secret stashes, they hid weapons and even radio stations. The resistance movement not only hid weapons, but also produced them. There were secret armaments plants.
Polskie podziemie zorganizowało tajną sieć warsztatów odpowiedzialnych za konstrukcję i produkcję broni palnej, granatów, miotaczy ognia, granatników i urządzeń wybuchowych. Podziemne warsztaty produkowały kilka typów granatów ręcznych,
Szczególnie cenionym przez oddziały partyzanckie rodzajem broni były granaty ręczne. Ich masową produkcję uruchomiono w konspiracyjnych wytwórniach. Do najliczniej produkowanych należała Sidolówka, której montaż uruchomiono w 1942 roku.
Originally made from the canister of a cleaning agent called Sidol, it was a grenade whose casing shattered when detonated.
Przed użyciem należało odkręcić korek zapalnika, jego gwałtowne szarpnięcie powodowało zatarcie masy zapalającej. Sidolówka była zasadniczo granatem zaczepnym, chociaż nierzadko wkładano do środka metalowe odłamki. Produkowano także szereg innych, improwizowanych i bardziej prymitywnych wzorów z wykorzystaniem wszelkich dostępnych materiałów, np. rur.
350,000 pieces of Sidolówka were produced and 240,000 pieces of another model, Filipinka. These weapons were used by underground soldiers in street battles. The increasingly well-armed underground army needed to coordinate their military actions, so a network of couriers was required. Intelligence reports were delivered through couriers. The most famous couriers were the so-called Tatra couriers, tracking through the Polish mountains. Courier routes led to neutral states, where the mail was received by the intelligence agency of the government in exile and the Allies. So couriers were able to reach Istanbul, Madrid, Lisbon, or Stockholm. And they had to reach their targets undetected.
Wyposażeni w fałszywe dokumenty wysłannicy podziemia pokonywali tysiące kilometrów i przekraczać musieli kilka pilnie strzeżonych granic.
Powstawały komórki produkujące fałszywe dokumenty dla żołnierzy Polskiego Państwa Podziemnego i innych osób.
One of the most extraordinary careers was Stanisław Marusarz, a ski jumper, alpine athlete, and an Olympian, who during the war was a Tatra courier on the Zakopane-Budapest route. He ran many a courier mission and was captured constantly. However, he somehow always managed to escape.
Najsłynniejszą ucieczką Marusarza było wyskoczenie z okna celi śmierci w więzieniu na Montelupich w Krakowie i pokonanie 4-metrowego muru.
After his escape, Maruszarz hid in Hungary.
Pod zmienionym nazwiskiem trenował skoczków narciarskich. W 1944 roku wziął udział w zawodach, podczas których rozpoznał go zawodnik z Niemiec, Józef Weiler. Na szczęście Niemiec uścisnął mu tylko dłoń i go nie wydał.
Polish intelligence needed an extensive network of couriers. Risking their lives, they delivered hundreds of pages of reports a month to the Allies. It was thanks to the couriers that it was possible to convey the greatest secrets of the Third Reich and coordinate a large underground resistance movement.
Kurierzy przynosili bardzo ważne informacje, na przykład mikrofilmy ze zdjęciami niemieckich fabryk, instalacji wojskowych, schematy broni. Mikrofilm była to zminiaturyzowana klisza filmowa, którą można było ukryć i skutecznie przemycić do miejsca przeznaczenia.
The intelligence decoded new, deadly technologies and weapons schematics.
Oraz plany i mapy lokalizujące fabryki tego uzbrojenia.
Some of the information that was smuggled out of Poland would have a dramatic impact on the outcome of World War II.
Probably if one looks in balance at the Polish contribution to the Second World War in terms of what was most effective, probably the number one thing would be the Polish contribution to intelligence.
Bez przygotowania wywiadowczego nie można przeprowadzić bezpiecznej i skutecznej operacji wojskowej.
Wywiad to oczy i uszy oddziałów bojowych. Posiadana lub zdobyta informacja wywiadowcza pozwala na określenie sił przeciwnika, jego uzbrojenie, sposoby działania czy też morale.
The Germans secretly developed a deadly technology of flying V-1 bombs, which were used to attack over long distances.
The rockets were showering down on London and elsewhere in the UK, causing havoc and, of course, great fear. The Western Allies were desperate to try and figure out where they were made, how did they work, how could they be stopped.
Nobody could feel safe. After developing the flying V-1 bomb, German scientists went on to develop a ballistic missile that could reach and attack any target. Hitler was about to use it, threatening Britain with a new weapon. The Luftwaffe dropped propaganda leaflets. What good are your planes, warships and tanks against the new German weapon? How about V number 2 to V number 10?
V2, Verwaltungswaffe 2, była sterowanym pociskiem balistycznym. Nie można było ani śledzić, ani zestrzelić V2. 7 września 1944 roku V2 została pierwszy raz wystrzelona bojowo na Paryż, a później Londyn.
The British desperately needed knowledge of Hitler's new weapon to stop the threat. It was the Polish intelligence of the underground army that acquired the greatest secrets of the German arms industry.
The discovery of actual whole pieces of the V-2 rocket, which was an amazing coup for the SOE and for the British. The intelligence contribution was something that really did shift the war in many ways.
Stefan Ignaszak był oficerem odpowiedzialnym za komórki wywiadu podziemnej armii w niemieckich portach nad Bałtykiem.
Roman Trager was installing telephone lines in Peenemünde.
Roman Trager, pracujący dla polskiego wywiadu, poinformował Ignaszaka, że w tajnej bazie na wyspie Peenemünde testowane są tajemnicze niemieckie bronie.
Poles managed to discover what was being made at Peenemünde and the extent of the factory site. And of course, this information was given to the Western Allies, and it resulted in devastating bombing raids and attacks on Peenemünde.
W nocy z 17 na 18 sierpnia 1943 roku 600 brytyjskich samolotów zbombardowało Peenemünde.
Destroy the site of rocket production, and of course, by so doing, stop the rockets being sent over to bomb London and other places in the UK.
The underground army's continued disruption to the German war machine led to the secret German police, the Gestapo. Rounding up and torturing members and collaborators for information.
The Gestapo was the sort of short form of the Geheimstaatspolizei, huge network of terror. Headquarters in Warsaw are in the Aleja Szucha, which is in the German district.
The Gestapo was recognized in the Nuremberg trials after the war as a criminal organization.
Many people were very, very terribly damaged there, tortured, interrogated. And many people died as well. The holding prison, if you will, was called Pawiak, which was a much bigger facility.
We wskazanym okresie Niemcy więzili za murami kompleksu około 100 000 ludzi. Między innymi reprezentantów przedwojennej polskiej elity oraz żołnierzy konspiracyjnej Armii Krajowej. Pawiak funkcjonował jako więzienie śledcze w gestii Gestapo.
The Gestapo was extremely brutal in extracting information from prisoners about the underground resistance movement. It was a terrible process. The arrested prisoners, after being registered by the Germans, were taken to a tram, to cells with wooden benches. It was here that they waited for their turn. Those called went up the stairs to one of the floors of the torture factory. Brutal interrogations were conducted there. People were broken for hours and sometimes for days. Testimonies were obtained that were to help in the fight against the underground state. The brutal realities of the interrogations are best illustrated by the drawings of a prisoner showing the methods of torture.
Jak nas wygonili na ten plac, to myśmy musieli się czołgać, żabki robić. I jak padli, to musieliśmy twarzą do ziemi. Jeżeli nie był twarzą do ziemi, to kopali se spali. Ta gimnastyka była straszna. Tam gidało na tym sporcie, gidało masę.
Here are the items left by prisoners, most of whom did not survive in the Paviak. Playing cards made of cardboard from a food package, chess pieces made of bread, figurines made of animal bones. Some prisoners were born here because pregnant women were also imprisoned.
Niemcy bardzo chcieli oddzielić matki od dzieci, matki wysłać do obozu koncentracyjnego, a dzieci odesłać do rodzin.
Dziecko półroczne, 1,5 roku, pierwsze życia spędziło w celi na Pawiaku. Jak Jaś miał 2 lata, to jego matkę wywieźli do Ravensbrück, a jego wezwali, tam zawiadomili rodzinę, żeby odebrała. W domu stał przy drzwiach, nie, z celi nie wolno, z celi nie dał się wyprowadzić na spacer, nie, z celi nie wolno. No jak się budził, to oczy przecierał, że światło bez krat, okna bez krat nareszcie.
Even in such a cruel place, so closely guarded by the Germans, it was possible to create an extensive underground network. They managed to communicate with the outside world, even organized daring escapes. The conspiratorial network was highly skillful, passing secret messages to and from the prison. Here is the key used by the security guard to lock the doors in the cells. The guard was a secret collaborator of the underground, and the key was a locker for carrying secret messages. The map shows how complicated the path was traveled by secret information. Behind the prison walls, the activity of the secret network was possible due to 2 Paviak hospitals. The medical personnel cooperated with the underground resistance. It is thanks to them that one of the most spectacular actions was carried out. The escape from Pawiak by Stanisław Miedza-Tomaszewski.
He was imprisoned in Pawiak by the Gestapo, but the AK managed to smuggle him out.
The doctor first gave Miedza-Tomaszewski a vaccine and then specially infected him with typhus.
Niemcy w obawie przed zachorowaniem na dór plamisty i wybuchem epidemii na terenie kompleksu więziennego zezwalali, aby chorego przewieźć na leczenie poza Pawiak.
Following the plan of the underground organization, Miedza-Tomaszewski began to simulate an appendicitis attack.
Plan zakładał upozorowanie jego śmierci podczas operacji.
The patient was taken to the operating room where medics had brought an almost identical body from the dissecting room. The Germans were not allowed into the operating room.
Germans found, quote unquote, this dead body with identification pointing that it was Tomaszewski. So they fortunately believed this and wrote in their documents that Tomaszewski had died. And the fortunate thing was, of course, that he hadn't. And he was able to then carry on with the freedom of not having a Gestapo file on him.
Meanwhile, Tomaszewski, in disguise, is led out by the hospital staff through the back door.
Miedza umarł, żeby przeżyć.
After escaping from Pawiak, he took part in subversive and propaganda activities against the Germans. He created, among others, posters and stamps for the underground during the Warsaw Uprising. After the war, he regularly visited the grave of his double. The hell unleashed by the Nazis, instead of breaking the Poles, united them in the fight. Next time, we will see the underground army take the fight to the occupiers using disruption and sabotage. We will discover how the bloodiest tortures were dealt with and the assassination of the head of the Gestapo. We will reveal the extraordinary secret units of the underground army, the ancestors of today's Black Ops.